Today we're back for the last of the 4 factions of Engine War. It's time to see what the Imperial Knights are getting out of this book. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we'll be looking at the Psychic Awakening update for the Imperial Knights, going through their full rules, including their Questor Allegiances, Allegiance-specific Warlord Traits, custom Households and Stratagems. We'll talk about each rule, how I think it might impact the game, and any obvious combos and synergies we can see with it. So the contents of Engine War for Imperial Knights contain 4 main parts. Probably the single biggest buff in the book are these Questor Allegiance Oaths, of which there's just 2, one for Mechanicus, one for Imperialis. It's basically a flat buff that you get to your Imperial Knight army. We then have 6 new Warlord Traits, 3 for Questor Mechanicus, 3 for Questor Imperialis. We have the option to substitute our regular households for custom households, which are very similar to the Chaos Knight book. In a rare display of parity, Games Workshop have made them almost identical to Chaos Knights, but with different names. There's just one trait that I believe is different. Finally, we have 14 new stratagems for the Imperial Knights, the majority of which focus around one individual knight each, so there's new ones for the Warden, Paladin, Errant, Crusader, Valiant, and so on. Plenty to talk about then, so let's jump straight into it with those oaths. So these Questor Allegiance Oaths are just flat benefits that you get on top of your already Imperial Knight army, so they basically unequivocally make them stronger. Basically you need to be in a super heavy detachment to get these, the same as you would with your households. Unfortunately you can't get them if you're just in a super heavy auxiliary. Much like households, you will need to be all one allegiance, you either all need to be Mechanicus or all need to be Imperialis. We've already seen the Mechanicus one previewed from Games Workshop. They can make the Sacristan Pledge, which allows you to heal 1 wound at the start of each of your turns. I'd describe this as a small but meaningful increase in durability. It does have the disadvantage that you won't be getting any benefit until your opponent starts to half kill your knights. For the first turn or so when they're undamaged it won't make any difference, and for any knights that they do just manage to wipe out in 1 full round of shooting, you won't get any benefit. But for any knights that do get chip damage given to them at some point during the game, it can be very psychologically damaging to see those wounds just regrow themselves, undoing the progress that your opponent feels that they've made. Certainly a very nice bonus to have, on top of the already strong Questor Mechanicum households. We haven't seen the Imperialis one yet though, which is the Vow of Honour. +1 to advance and charge moves will certainly keep your knights moving around the battlefield faster. It can be a really massive difference whether a knight makes a charge or not, and having +1 to those charges will mean that they go off just that little bit more reliably. It's sort of basically a mini version of Landstrider, which is an excellent warlord trait, farmed out to every Imperialis knight in the army. Like Landstrider, it's excellent with the full tilt stratagem, the one where you basically pay 2 command points to allow yourself to advance and charge. It means that you could be making some very surprisingly long charges that your opponent just doesn't see coming. Basically this bonus to move and charging doesn't stack with any other modifiers, as if this had been allowed it would have been some really crazy little charge bonuses with +3 to charge and +3 to advance. I'd just describe this as again a small but meaningful increase, certainly a very nice to have and you do get it for free, although I'd argue that this one's a little bit less universal than the Questor Mechanicus one because you're not going to get that much out of it unless you are actually making charges. Not quite as good for things like Armiger Helverins or any shooty knights, but then typically most of the Questor Imperialis households are geared up a bit more towards close combat. I do find it a bit of a shame that you can't pair this with the Mechanicus House Raven, which would have been quite nice for those extra moves on advancing, because they can advance and shoot. I'm not sure if these are massively going to sway you to one household or the other. As I said, they're both fairly small benefits, but they're just something that's nice to have on top of the bonuses that you already get for households and things. Next we come on to the Questor Allegiance Warlord Traits, and we get 3 for Mechanicus and 3 for Imperialis. Always good to have a few more options of these ones, as we do have the opportunity to have up to 3 Warlord Traits, and can buy them in with extra command points if they're worth it for the given matchup. On the Mechanicus side we have Paragon of the Omnissiah. This just gives you an extra 2 wounds to your Warlord's wounds characteristic, so maybe a 26 wound Knight Crusader or something. Again, a small but meaningful increase in durability. Basically, if you want to turn your command points into more wounds on your knights, then this is a way to do it. I don't think it's typically going to be as strong as getting the 4+ invulnerable save that you can get for the Iron Bulwark Warlord trait, so against the majority of ranged armies I'd take that instead. But if you're playing a melee army where all the attacks are going to be in close combat, or you just want to turn 1 command point into a couple of extra wounds on knights, then this is an option. Not enormously strong though in my opinion. Next we have Cold Eradication, which is an interesting one for random number of attack weapons. Basically when determining the number of attacks that this warlord makes with a weapon that has a random number of attacks, e.g. heavy d6, roll 1 additional dice and discard 1 of the dice. Now obviously this is going to have some powerful effects on some knights and very little effect on others, although the vast majority do have at least 1 random shot weapon. Basically, if you do the maths, this will average you an extra shot per turn with each heavy D6 weapon that you fire, very slightly more than one extra shot with a heavy 2D6 weapon, and around about half an extra shot from every D3 weapon that you fire. So it's not awful in damage output from a Knight Errant, for example. Basically 28% increase in the damage output from the thermal cannon. Good for around about an extra wound or two on enemy vehicles each time you fire it. And it certainly makes sense to be throwing on an Ironstorm missile pod to the top of the thing if you are using this Warlord trait. You're probably going to get the biggest bang for your buck on a Knight Castellan, as generating extra shots with that mighty Volcano Lance, massive plasma gun and Siegebreaker cannons are going to add up to a fair amount of damage increase, although again you might be tempted to take Iron Bulwark, because if you're buying such an expensive knight then you need to keep it safe. This one will be a lot better if you could use it on, say, a dual thermal cannon knight like the Chaos Knights can, but unfortunately we can't take that option. Finally, we have Calculated Targeting, which is an unusual shooting buff, which means that whenever you're shooting you always get a hit on an unmodified hit roll of 4+. Now I find this one a little bit weird, to be honest. You're not going to get any benefit at all if you're targeting at most targets, and even if you're targeting -1 to hit modifier targets, when you have a 3-up ballistic skill, then you're still going to be successful and this won't make a difference. It's really only going to make a difference if you're either in your bottom bracket, or if you're in your middle bracket and you're firing at -1 to hit targets, or you're firing at -2 to hit targets, which as we know are going away shortly in 9th edition. Honestly, I think that this is far too marginal to be worth bothering with, to be honest, so I wouldn't take this one. Just in case I didn't mention it, it doesn't work in Overwatch, by the way. Onto the Questor Imperialis traits now, and the first one that we have is Revered Knight. This one's the always fight first in the fight phase one, which I'm really not the biggest fan of at the best of times, and really not on Imperial Knights either, because they have the helpful ability just to be able to drop back, maybe shoot with all of their guns, and then charge in afresh, so they should be fighting first normally, unless they desperately need to be sticking around in close combat anyway, and even then you get to nominate the first unit under normal circumstances. This one's a bit of a pass from me, I'm afraid. Next though we have a more interesting one called Strike and Shield, which is actually quite a powerful defensive melee debuff. Firstly, and most helpfully, you get -1 to hit rolls from the enemy when they're in close combat with the knight, which is definitely going to have an impact on the amount of damage it's taking, so it could be a very reasonable pickup if you're fighting a mainly melee enemy. Armies like Blood Angels or Orcs really aren't going to thank you for this. On top of that, if they're within 1 inches of a vehicle or monster, then that vehicle or monster gets -1 to their attacks as well, so it's sort of a double defensive debuff against those. This one's a particularly nice to have in a mirror match against enemy knights, or even just any enemy unit with melee vehicles, such as perhaps Space Marine Invictor Warsuits, to name one example. This is a good one to buy in reactively against melee threats, so I think this is a good Warlord trait and a good one for the Questor Imperialis. Obviously I wouldn't use this in every game, as it's just not likely to be relevant against all armies. Finally, we have Tireless Duty. This one is a 6-inch heroic intervention type move. Again, it's kind of a nice to have, but I wouldn't buy it in as a Warlord trait myself. If you do, then your opponent's basically going to know that that's going to be the case, and if they position properly, then they can just keep their units out of that 6-inch heroic intervention range. So at best, all you're doing is messing with their movement priorities, and if they just charge the knight anyway with their own melee threat, then this isn't going to make any difference either. I don't think that this one's quite good enough to compete with the other Warlord traits, I'm afraid. So out of the Warlord traits, I think the Paragon of the Omnissiah and Cold Eradication are certainly interesting buy-ins on the Mechanicus side, though I'd only buy them in after I've already taken Iron Bulwark against the vast majority of armies. For the Imperialis, I really like Strike and Shield, and would buy that one in reactively against melee armies to make one knight just extra hard to kill in the fight phase. Next I thought we'd go through the stratagems for the Imperial Knights, as some of these are quite interesting and new ideas that we've not seen before. I do quite like the way that they've given basically each class of knight their own little stratagem to play with, just to give them their own unique options on the table. First up, for the Knight Errant, we have Close Quarters Destruction, and this will allow you to re-roll the wound roll at half range for the Knight Errant's thermal cannon. Now, Knight Errants don't tend to be taken absolutely loads these days, although they're at least fairly cheap, they are often passed up for the Knight Crusader. I think this is certainly a bit of a leg up for them. Basically against most vehicle targets, this is going to amount to a 33% damage increase, obviously presuming that you are within 18 inches of the enemy, which certainly isn't guaranteed. As standard, your thermal cannon will do an average of about 7 wounds to most standard vehicle targets at this range, as you're getting the Melter special rule as a benefit, so using this stratagem will increase that to around about 9 or 10. Just making your Knight Errant a little bit more reliable, although I would weigh this up against just using one command point to re-roll a wound roll for your Knight Errant if you're against these targets. If you do have a spare command point free in the shooting phase, and you happen to be at half range, then on average you do get more return for one command point just rolling a single wound roll, compared with using this stratagem. That's just because there's the chance that you might not succeed any hit rolls, for example, and you might not fail any wound rolls if you do get a bunch of hits, and in both of those cases the stratagem is completely useless, and even then if you only fail one wound roll, you could just command reroll it and have the exact same outcome. So this one isn't too bad, but it is slightly worse than just using one command reroll, unless you're saving that for another time in the shooting phase, which is reasonable. Next we have Flanking Maneuver. This one's a little bit of a movement buff which allows you to get an 8-inch advance if you're within 12 inches of a board edge at the end of the move. This will be lovely to combine with Full Tilt for an extra long charge, but unfortunately you can't do that. The stratagem specifically states that you can't charge after it. It is a fairly meaningful movement buff. Compared with a standard advance, you'll be getting around about an extra 4 or 5 inches of movement on average. Could be kind of reasonable for something like a Knight Gallant if you're sure that you're not going to be able to make a charge that turn. Next we have Thin Their Ranks for 1 command point. This is similar to what the Chaos Knights get, in that Armiger Helverins get an automatically 12 shots with their Armiger autocannons against units of 6 or more. Basically this will net you an extra 4 shots on average out of those Armiger autocannons, and is going to be most efficient against things like Space Marine Aggressors, or other 3-wound units like Borgrin or Harlequin Skyweavers that come in large units as well. When targeting Aggressors for example, you can roundabout expect 1 extra Aggressor to die from using this stratagem, which is a pretty reasonable return on investment I think. Next we have a Knight Preceptor stratagem, which is Capacitor Charge. Basically their Las Impulsor, when fired on the high intensity strength 12 profile, gets a heavy 6 shots rather than having to roll the d6 number. So 1 command point for essentially an extra 2.5 Las Impulsor shots on average, which against most toughness 7 or toughness 8 vehicle targets without an invul, that'll translate into around about an extra 4 damage on your opponent. Not bad for 1 command point if you do happen to be within 18-inch range. Next we have a fun one called Hurled Wreckage. This one allows the Thunderstrike Gauntlet to get a bit of an upgrade on its throwing the wreckage of a vehicle at an enemy unit ability, where basically if you target a vehicle with this attack and use this stratagem, then you don't have to roll any dice or anything to see if it hits or how many damage it does. It's just an automatically flat 3 mortal wounds against that monster or vehicle that you target. So a nice guaranteed little upgrade there. Probably going to be most powerful if that 3 mortal wounds is going to be the difference between that vehicle being alive or being dead. It'd be good for putting the final nail in the coffin if the stars do align, so worth remembering I think. Next we have Pack Tactics, which is an Armiger one, and you use it when you have a bunch of Armigers all in combat with one enemy unit. If there's 2 Armigers in combat with that one enemy unit, then you get +1 attack for both of them, and if you happen to have 3 or more, then each Armiger in that combat gets +2 attacks. Games Workshop really seem to want to incentivize Armigers working together, although in practice it is just a little bit clunky to achieve, just due to it being hard to coordinate big charges on a small unit with multiple units with huge bases like the Armigers. You might often make combat with one but not another, or have your body Armiger destroyed as it's advancing. In any case, if you are going for some sort of mass Armiger strategy, then this one could be kind of useful. I think it could be particularly handy if you're trying to thin out a horde, maybe a big unit of Orc Boys, which you have managed to get 3 Armigers into. An extra 6 Armiger attacks for 1 command point is no joke at all. It's a bit more marginal if you're only getting 2 attacks when there's only 2 of the things. Continuing on with our stratagems now, we have Trophy Claim, another one that the Chaos Knights get too, where basically if your knight kills an enemy Titanic in melee, then they get +1 attack for the rest of the game. Not bad if you do manage to kill one early, maybe a little bit more marginal if it's later in the game. I'd likely only think about it if this does happen, and if your opponent isn't just likely to kill said knight in the next turn, leaving you no benefit whatsoever. Next we have a pair of quite interesting ones for the Knight Valiant, the first being Electrothermic Overload, which is an interesting sort of shock attack for the Thundercoil Harpoon. This one, unlike the rest of them, costs 2 command points, so is a little bit more pricey, and basically you use it once an enemy unit has suffered damage from the Thundercoil Harpoon. For 2 command points, every unit within 3 inches of said unit will get handed d3 mortal wounds. Obviously this is just absolutely ideal if you do manage to skewer an enemy vehicle that's surrounded by other units, and this could genuinely be a decent amount of extra damage for the command points invested. It sort of makes it a bit interesting that if you don't have any viable vehicle targets, you could just plough this straight into a horde that's within 3 inches of a lot of other units, and maybe help fry a whole load of characters and things. I'd say in general, if you can catch, say, another 4 units with this attack, then it's likely to be worth it in terms of command points for mortal wound output, obviously depending exactly what those targets are. Definitely one to remember that you have, and certainly another big one to hope that you actually hit with the harpoon and don't fail that all-important hit roll. The other one for the Valiant is a 1 command point repulsing conflagration, which basically makes your Valiant -2 to charge after it's fired Overwatch. This one could be particularly handy if a very hardy threat wants to try and charge your Valiant out of Deep Strike. 9-inch charge plus 2 inches means that you're going to need an 11-inch charge to charge the thing, so it's just going to be very unlikely for your opponent to make that, even if they have other buffs. I'm not 100% sure how often this is going to come up. Most people don't tend to want to charge a Knight Valiant if it's going to be able to overwatch at full capacity, as eating all the shots from that conflagration cannon is going to put a decent amount of damage on any enemy unit no matter what it is. I guess it gives you just another reason not to want to charge a Knight Valiant. Next we have one command point for Belligerent Machine Spirit, which is the one that we saw previewed for the Night Warden. Basically it allows an Avenger Gatling cannon to automatically hit when you're less than 8 inches away from the enemy. Less than 8 inches isn't a bad place to be, just because it will allow your heavy flamer to fire as well, so I guess that just doubles down on this reward. One command point will net you an additional 4 hits on average with that Avenger Gatling cannon, so maybe something like an extra 2 dead intercessors if that's what you're firing at. Could be worth it depending on the target and how much you need them dead, and whether or not you're just going to stomp them flat in the assault phase anyway. Next we have Siegebreaker Bombardment from the Knight Castellan. Basically, if the knight's not moved, then you get +1 to the wound roll with its Siegebreaker cannons for the shooting phase. The not moving part is really something I'm not a fan of, to be honest. Even with its slightly less movement of 10 inches, the Knight Castellan can really reposition well, get in some optimal ranges, or just stay out of enemy threat range. Giving that movement up, particularly on such a powerful gun platform, is generally not the best idea. But if you do have optimal range and line of sight, and you weren't planning on moving anyway, then I guess you can use this. You'll typically get about 8 shots out of those Siegebreaker cannons. This will help them out a bit against pretty much any target, particularly toughness 7 and 8 vehicles. I will say that the damage output isn't overly impressive, to be honest. Say if you're firing it at a standard toughness 7 vehicle with a 3+ save, you'll only get about 1 extra wound for your command point, so it's not exactly great on them. I don't think that this is a particularly exciting stratagem, to be honest, because it both limits your movement and isn't amazing damage output, and certainly wouldn't be much compared with using a command reroll to reroll the number of shots on your Volcano Lance, for example. Next we have one command point for Linebreaker, which allows a Gallant to pile in and consolidate 6 inches in the fight phase. I guess that could occasionally be useful if he happens to have charged a target and then finds himself high and dry because the enemy's removed casualties because you've killed it with something else in your knight army. Obviously any time that it's going to make the difference between that pile in meaning that he makes a combat or doesn't, it's going to be pretty much an auto-use stratagem. I could see this being pretty handy for House Terran as well, who have the opportunity to fight twice with their Gallants. This could equate to a lot of extra movement and maybe catching other enemy units in combat that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. Theoretically, if all things go to plan, this could be an extra 12-inch movement with a House Terran Gallant, which could certainly be the difference between locking up an important enemy unit or not, or even just positioning it in an optimal place for it to explode next turn. Next, for one command point, we have Cover the Advance, which is a stratagem for the Knight Crusader, and this one's really quite a useful one, particularly if you're allying in Crusaders with other armies. Basically, when he targets a unit, and if the unit takes any damage from his Avenger Gatling cannon, thermal cannon, or rapid fire battle cannon, then it means that the unit can't overwatch. This could be incredibly significant if it's something like, say, an enemy Knight Valiant, just for example, or something like a big scary unit of Centurions, who are likely to be putting a bunch of damage into the enemy's biggest, scariest threats anyway, so if you want them to be not overwatching this turn, then this is an excellent use of one command point. Good in a knight army, and good for an allied crusader, which is one of the strongest knights that you can take as allies in my opinion. So honestly, this is a really strong buff to the Knight Crusader. Finally, we've got one command point for Thunderstruck, which is an interesting option for the Knight Paladin and his rapid fire battle cannon. It also affects the Thunder Voltaris as well, the unique household relic. Basically, rather than being damaged D3 for that turn, this one makes your rapid fire battle cannon a flat damage of 3. So a flat 50% increase against hard targets. Against toughness 7 vehicles, rather than doing 4 damage in a phase, it will do 6 damage in a phase, and of course you might be able to stack that with other buffs to make it even more meaningful, maybe extra damage from the Headsman's Mark from Krast for example, or using Admech Knight of the Cog to make that battle cannon strength 9, which you can now do with a Mars Admech Forge World. It's a bit of a shame that it's limited to Knight Paladins only. This would be very nice to have as an option on the Crusader as well, but I guess it gives you 1 extra draw to take your Paladin over the very good Knight Crusaders. So a reasonably small increase in damage output, but it could be stacked with other things, and certainly pretty strong if you're targeting 3 wound infantry like Aggressors, Bulgarins or Harlequin Skyweavers. So out of the stratagems, I really like the Crusader one for ignoring Overwatch. I think that's powerful and will be used. I do like the way that they've given further options to each individual class of knights to try and incentivise you taking them, of which I think that capacitor charge on the Knight Preceptor is really interesting. It actually turns that Las Impulsor into a fairly dangerous weapon if you're willing to spend a command point. And I think that the Knight Valiant's Electrothermic Overcharge could be a really fun way to throw around a bunch of mortal wounds in the enemy army if the target is in the right place. So finally, let's get on to custom households, which are an option to trade out your standard household traits or some of the traits on this list, either one selection from the ones on the left or two selections from the ones on the right. Unfortunately, this can't be given to free blades, and it gives up the opportunity of taking any of the specific household warlord traits, relics or stratagems, which can be quite a big draw to one or more of the houses, whether it's Crass Headsman's Mark or House Tyrannus allowing you to get a knight back up from the dead. Basically all of these are the same as the Dread household traits from Codex Chaos Knights, aside from one trait which gives them rerolls against demons and psykers compared with rerolls against Imperium. For once, Games Workshop can't really be accused of favouritism with these two. Also, you can take any of these with your Questor Imperialis or Questor Mechanicus, which does give you a certain amount of freedom. Firstly, let's start with the single traits, the ones that you can only have one of. First of all, we have Shattered Empire Stalkers, which gives your knight the advantage of being in cover if they're greater than 24 inches away. This one could be particularly nice in combination with, say, things like Armiger Helverins, which want to be lurking at the back. A 2+ armor save will be certainly something that they'll enjoy, and it could be particularly powerful on something like a knight with the armor of Sainted Ion, which already gives them a 2+ save, so getting that down to essentially a 1+ save is pretty nice indeed. For most knights though, this is going to be only meaningful against AP-2 or worse weapons, because beyond that you have your Invul save, and even then you do have the ability to rotate Ion Shields. So not a bad defensive buff, in some situations to be really useful, but in others you might have done better with something like House Tyrannus with a 6+ Feel No Pain type save. Next we have Unremitting. This allows you to reroll a single number of attack dice each time that your knight makes an attack. So say for example if you had a knight with a thermal cannon and it was firing with random damage weapons, you could reroll that dice if it say rolled a 1 or 2 or something and try and fish for something better. If you're firing with something such as an errant with just one single heavy d6 shot, then you get around about a 20% buff to your damage output for that one weapon. So it is genuinely a bit of a shooting upgrade, but unfortunately it doesn't work on things like Avenger Gatling cannons, which are one of the best weapons that Imperial Knights have. If you're running a trio of errants, I could kind of see this being worth it, if all you wanted was a bit of extra firepower out of each of those thermal cannons. Next we have Hunters of the Unseen. This is Ignores Cover, and it's going to be most relevant on anything with a lower AP, things like Rapid Fire Battle Cannons or Avenger Gatling Cannons. Another pretty useful trait for a shooting knight household in my opinion. This one certainly could be meaningful against armies like Marines, where when they're getting 2+ saves with the benefit of cover with their infantry, they're just a bit hard to shift with AP-2 weapons. Next we have Honoured Sacristans, which means that any AP-1 attacks that target your knight get to be AP0 instead. Personally not the biggest fan of this one, just because the majority of AP-1 attacks aren't particularly efficient against knights anyway. Things like autocannons will typically be wounding on 5s. It's also pretty matchup specific, as a lot of armies might not even have any weapons that are AP-1. Next we have Survivors of Strife. This one's just some extra wounds. It gives you +1 wound to your armigers, or +2 wounds to your other knights. So again, a bit of a durability buff here, particularly good if you want tougher knights that are Questor Imperialis, but in general, unless you're facing damage from mortal wounds, for the Questor Mechanicus, House Tyrannus will get you more survivability. Basically the 6+ Feel No Pain for Tyrannus maths out to be a 20% increase in durability, where for a 24 wound knight, this one's only an 8% increase. It's just not really as good. Next we have Pains of the Old Knight, which I thought was an interesting title for a trait. Basically this is the one that allows you to reroll wound rolls of 1 versus psykers or demons. Very matchup specific this one. You're not going to get much benefit against this for the vast majority of the field. There is a pretty reasonable offensive damage buff if you are playing an army that consists entirely of those models, something like Grey Knights or Chaos Demons for example. Not something I'd consider competitive for a take all comers list though. Finally, for the one trait picks, we have Machine Focus, which is +1 hit rolls when you have negative modifiers affecting your knights. So say if you're firing at some planes with -1 to hit, you're essentially going to be ignoring that -1 to hit penalty. Again, it's helpful to have, but not really something to select as a household trait, just again because it's not very take all comers. It's going to be good against some matchups where you're facing armies that have entirely -1 to hit, and absolutely useless in other matchups where they don't. So if you're picking 2 of the traits, then you can pick any 2 of these. First we have Aggressive Persecution, which is rerolling a damage dice every time you attack, whether that's shooting, combat or Overwatch. It's going to be best whenever you have a damage d6 weapon, say again something like a thermal cannon, where provided you're only firing one of the things, it's going to be around about a 15 to 20% increase in damage output. Could be a reasonable pickup if you're going to be running a detachment of Knight Errants, or maybe Armiger Warglaives with those thermal spears. Next we have Blessed Arms, for a +6 inch range benefit to any weapons that are 24 inches or more, or a +2 inch range benefit to those that are less than 24. Again, this is a pretty useful one for a shooty knight household. and I think it's going to be most relevant on anything with a 36-inch range, things like Avenger Gatling cannons or thermal cannons, where I think it is genuinely going to either make the difference of what targets you're able to shoot that turn, or whether you're able just to hang back a little bit more and outrange the opponent a bit. Possibly not a bad pick on a trio of Crusaders with thermal cannons and Avenger Gatling cannons, just to allow you to fight the opponent on your terms a bit more. Could be interesting as well with some outflanking armigers, maybe use the Moirax variant with the Rad Cleansers, and you could potentially deep strike them within range of flaming. Next up we have Glorified History, which again every time you shoot, fight or make an Overwatch attack, you can reroll one single hit roll for your knight, sort of like Salamanders or Master Artisan style rerolls, but only to hit. This one's generally going to reward you just a little bit more every time you fight or make a close combat action. It's actually reasonably powerful as it does buff both, and you can be rerolling some very meaningful dice, whether you're firing things like thermal cannons or thermal spears, or making attacks that reroll huge combat weapons with a flat damage of 6. I think that this one could stack really quite well with the Aggressive Persecution one, the one that allows you to reroll damage dice, and just give your army some incredibly nasty thermal cannons or thermal spears on Armiger Warglaives. I'd say in general that this one could actually be slightly better than that, because it also applies well to your close combat attacks, where Aggressive Persecution doesn't very well due to most knight combat attacks being flat 3 or flat 6 damage. Next we have Slayers of Beasts, again a little bit matchup specific but a bit more helpful. Basically this is a melee bonus that gives you +1 to the hit rolls when you're fighting vehicles or monsters. Very sadly it doesn't apply to a Titanic feat though, so it could be helpful for things like Wardens or Paladins when in combat with enemy knights or something. Vehicles and monsters do tend to crop up in most armies at least, but sometimes you're not always going to be able to deal with them in close combat, say if they're well screened behind a lot of enemy infantry or something. So not one of the worst, but I'm not sure it's one of the best either. Next we have Defiant Fury, which means that when your knight's on less than half wounds, you get +1 attack and +1 to hit in melee, just to basically counteract the vehicle damage table in melee at least. And actually when they're first bracketed, they'll actually get just that little bit stronger. Not an unreasonable pick on an army that it contains gallants or armigers. They may be a little bit less useful if you have access to Machine Spirit Resurgent, and there is always the possibility that your knight's just going to be destroyed outright, so you never get advantage of this. Next we have Storm Striders, which is a +1 inch to move benefit, and always moving on the top brackets no matter how bracketed you are. So basically these knights are going to be extra mobile and going very fast even until they die. Again very handy in movement for Questor Imperialis without access to Machine Spirit Resurgent, and +1 inches to movement through the whole game might well net you extra charges from time to time. It stacks quite well with the Questor Imperialis Allegiance Oath as well. Having +1 to move, advance and charge is really quite handy. Hounds of War is an armiger specific benefit, and this allows them to, if they're in close combat, to fall back and either shoot or charge in the ensuing turn. If they shoot then they're -1 to hit, but it's certainly better than nothing for armiger helperins, although this doesn't apply to charging. Could be a reasonable pickup if you are taking an army with a ton of armigers in it, although hopefully in most cases you are trying to keep your helperins free from close combat, as that's not where they want to be. Next we have Noble Combatants, which is quite a powerful melee buff, though again very sadly doesn't apply to Titanic feats. Basically every unmodified roll of a 6 to hit means that you get 1 additional hit, so that equates to a 25% buff to melee damage output for all knights with a 3+, or a 20% increase for knight gallants. For me I think that this one's most relevant on Armiger Warglaives, because basically both of their attacks are not with their Titanic feat as they don't have any, so this trait could certainly make them just that bit more lethal in close combat. Could be pretty nice in combination with Glorified History, so it could both be getting extra exploding hits on 6s, then also re-rolling a failed hit in close combat, so they're just going to be far more dangerous than they'd ordinarily be. Next we have Exacting Charge, which makes your close combat attacks better by AP-1 in the first round of close combat, again excluding Titanic feat unfortunately. For the most part I don't think that this one's very good to be honest. The vast majority of knight weapons that aren't feat have very high AP already, so this is only going to be a minor buff, and it's only going to be relevant when your target has a good save and no invul. Again, I suppose best use might be on an Armiger Warglaives Chain Cleaver, when it happens to be doing the sweep attack, but typically I think Noble Combatants will almost always outshine this one. I think I'd also generally prefer the Glorified History trait as well, as the single reroll can be used both in the shooting and in the fight phase. Next we have Guardians of the Frontier, which is +1 attack in close combat whenever you're fighting a unit with 11 or more models in. Again, far too matchup specific for me. Going to be handy against things like orcs, but even if the stars do align and you do happen to be fighting an army that's literally all hordes, it's not really all that much stronger than some of these other options. Next we have Frontline Fighters. This one gives your ranged AP better by AP-1 whenever you're within 12 inches of the enemy. Again, this one's likely going to be best on anything with lower AP, things like Avenger Gatling cannons or rapid fire battle cannons, but it does sort of mess with your movement a bit, as you might be making the difficult decision as to whether or not you're going to shoot at the thing just in front of your face to get the extra AP on it, or whether you're going to actually use the range of these weapons and target things that might be more of a threat on the battlefield. In general, I think that this is going to be an unhelpful choice a lot of the time, so I think that the range restriction on this one does kill it a bit for me. Next we have Steel Sinewed Arm, which means that you don't get any penalties for advancing and shooting with assault weapons. I guess not too bad on the Armature variants, which means that they could be advancing and firing at full capacity each turn. I believe that this one's pretty much unique to the Armature Warglaive, with its Assault D3 Thermal Spear. I guess it's not bad not to have to make the decision between advancing and using the weapon to its maximum capacity, but I think I prefer to have traits that just give me raw extra damage output. This one's only ever going to help you if you are actually advancing and still want to fire the thermal cannon. And don't forget that you can still fire the thermal cannon anyway, you'll just be at -1 to hit, which isn't the end of the world. Finally, we have Sanctified Armour for a 5+ Feel No Pain against Psychic Powers. Again, horribly matchup dependent, very useful if you're against Grey Knights or Thousand Suns if they do take over the meta at some point, but otherwise completely useless against many other armies. So I do find quite a lot of these quite interesting. I'm just not sure whether I'd want to give up something quite powerful, in particular things like House Tyrannus' 6-up Feel No Pain, or maybe House Crass 4 rerolls in the first round of close combat, both of which are pretty powerful additional options, and of course both of those households also come with extra kits such as powerful stratagems or relics. Out of these though, I think some certainly do stand out. Ignores Cover on a trio of Crusaders could be really quite handy, particularly if you're using any combos with Avenger Gatling cannons and rapid fire battle cannons. Unremitting for rerolling a single number of attack dice could be pretty great on anything like thermal cannons if you are using multiple of them. And if you're going for the multiple traits, then there's multiple good combos that seem to work really well together on things like Armature Warglaives, though probably my favourite are the Exploding Sixes in melee and the single reroll of a hit in the shooting and fight phases, both of which are really quite decently powerful damage boosts. I feel like Chaos Mass Armatures are going to do a bit better than ours though, just because of how good their Iconoclast bonus is, getting extra attacks and AP on the charge, although I suppose Questor Imperialis will get into those combats just that little bit more reliably. So I think this update on the whole tends to give some reasonably minor buffs to Imperial Knights, I'm afraid. Obviously there's no arguing that the Mechanicus and Imperialis Household Oaths are really quite useful, but they're not exactly game changers in my eyes. A couple of the Warlord Traits could be good, but they do have the opportunity cost of taking something else. And the Stratagems of course have an opportunity cost, but they have given us some powerful new options, particularly suppressing Overwatch with a Crusader, or giving a bit more of a reason to take things like Valiants or Preceptors, which is always nice to see. I think the custom households, I remain to be convinced how much they're going to be seeing play. I think they give you different options to the ones that we already have in the households, but they're not necessarily stronger options. If you can see any interesting combos or things that I've missed, or if there's something that you think I've underrated, please let us know down in the comments. It'd be interesting to hear your ideas. And if you want to see more 40k content like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll have a few more videos on Imperial Knights coming out over the next couple of weeks. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then any support on Patreon is greatly appreciated, as it is what allows me to spend so much time making videos about model soldiers or stompy death machines. As well as helping support the channel, you also get to see some new videos early for being a Patreon member. There are regular prize draws each month where I post out some miniatures to lucky winners somewhere in the world, and you also get to vote to see what sort of videos come next on the channel. So if any of that sounds good, or you just like to help keep these videos coming, then the Patreon link is down in the description below. So a big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.